I kind of see some parallels here taking place in regards to Emmett Till, that suddenly when it's not going to look good for whites, that we're going to change the narrative and go on the attack, blame the victims, if you will, which
Yeah.
is really what happened to Emmett Till. Was they started blaming him for his own death. Well, he shouldn't have done this, he shouldn't have done that, he should have known better. Uh, they were even raising questions about, did he get in trouble in Chicago, right? And why would his mother have to warn him about not being, not being smart to people in Mississippi, particularly white people, and that if you have to, get on the ground and grovel,
Yeah.
basically. So they were like, they're raising these questions about his integrity, which is always seems to be happening. It was, well, maybe he was doing drugs, maybe this, maybe that. When we talk about people, African Americans who get killed today, so someone gets shot by the police, and suddenly they have to question this, the victim's background, as if that's justification for why the police would have killed him. So there was this justification for why they would have killed Emmett Till, and you see that this happens time and time again. This
We see everything that we hear today happening then,
right.
without exception. Even the accusations that, oh, if it had been a white person, we wouldn't have heard one thing about it. You hear that one now.
Right.
And which wasn't true. And these cases make the paper, but then there's the complexities behind that as far as systemic issues that raise attention in a different way, as opposed to local matters that where attention is, or justice is swift. It doesn't need the protests in the same way, because you're protesting the lack of justice. And when justice is swift in the case of a white person being killed, it doesn't need that attention. It's being taken care of. And that's what we saw back then too. People, because around the same time as the Emmett Till murder, there was some 3 white boys that were murdered. And I don't even know if the person who killed him was black. I don't even think that was the issue. But people were complaining, oh, where's the outrage over this? And there was plenty of outrage.
Right.
But that's what we hear now. People make that assumption because they need to create a certain narrative, and they need to create a myth around it that they can cling to.
So the narrative of Emmett Till, once they set that narrative in place, that even the authorities, Sheriff Strider starts to change his story to match that story. Because when they pulled Emmett Till from the river, he immediately identifies Emmett Till as African American and signs the death warrant, the death certificate as such. But then suddenly his story starts to change. Even on the stand, his story doesn't match what he actually had set forth when they pulled Emmett Till's body from the river. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's really the most bizarre part of this case in so many ways, because yes, when the day the body is identified, he states to the press that it was an African-American male, looks like he'd been in the river for about 2 days. He put a pencil in the hole in the head to determine, yes, it was a bullet hole. He turned the body over to a African-American mortician, and he took Moses Wright's word for it when he came and identified the body. And then had the family, he tried to get the family to bury, well, he ordered basically the family to bury the body within 3 hours of discovery. So he turned it over to them. It's going to be buried at Moses Wright's church. They had the grave dug and were holding a funeral when the deputy sheriff of LaFleur County came out with another uncle of Emmett Till and said, stop this, the mother wants the body sent home. And as you said, Sheriff Strider signed the death certificate. So everything on the day of, when everything's freshest in their mind, it's Emmett Till, and there's no controversy about that. The day Emmett Till is buried, that following Tuesday, Sheriff Strider starts telling the press, looked like he'd been in the river for, I can't remember if it was 8 days, something far too long for it to have been Emmett Till, because he'd only been missing a few days. He said the body was as white as I am when they pulled it out of the river. I don't know if it was African American. Don't even know if it was male. And and he thought, and he was starting this idea, that Emmett Till was even still alive, that the whole thing had been a hoax concocted by the NAACP.
Well, that T.R.M. Howard would have had, because he was a doctor, could have provided a body to put.
Right. Yeah. So that was, and that they put the ring on the finger that Moses Wright identified as being Emmett Till's ring that had belonged to Emmett Till's father, that Emmett was wearing. And so, and that's such a bizarre thing. He doesn't explain ever how he went from what he said on the day of. He acted like that was just, he didn't even indicate or admit that he changed his story. He just said, that body was as white as I am, and he's been in the river too long, and Emmett Till's still alive. And the crazy thing about that is, also is if he's the sheriff of Tallahatchie County, there was a body that they pulled from the river, and he's content to just let it stay buried up in Chicago. He doesn't ask for it back so he could try to, if there was another murder in his community, without the body, he's never going to be able to know who that was. He doesn't care. He just lets the body stay there. So how you can even take him seriously is just beyond me. I mean, it was just the craziest thing. And when he's asked about it at the trial, he denies, he said, I signed the death certificate, but he signed it in blank or something like that. But you see the death certificate, it's filled out by him, and he says it was Emmett Till. He died by a bullet or an axe. Mm-hmm. And then he later on, when he was changing his story, he said he didn't even know if he'd been killed by a bullet, if it'd been killed at all. It was just somebody they threw in there. And so all this stuff that was just made no sense whatsoever, but it's stuff that he got away with.
Well, the thing is, though, if you think about it a minute, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know who it was, but I know that somebody had a conversation with him that told him, you're the sheriff and you want to continue being the sheriff, here's what you do. So you deny, you muddy the water at least about this being Emmett Till or not Emmett Till. We don't want the body back here. We don't want it. We don't want anybody else investigating this crime. Here's what's going to happen at the trial. So the sheriffs of those counties held their position at the pleasure of other people. And all that happened, all that I saw, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened, but all that I saw was he was told what to say, he was told what to do, and his first response was to act as a sheriff. His second response was to act as a white member of society. And that's what he did. He knew exactly what he was doing. We see a lot of that going on now. I'll tell a story, you figure out if I'm right or wrong. And it matters more that we think that he was wrong than it does anybody that we think he was wrong than the people that he was working for, that the Citizens Council or the members of the community that he worked for. So I think he knew what he was doing. I think all the confusion, it confuses us because it doesn't sound like the same guy, but nobody had gotten to him and told him what to say. And that's what he did on the witness stand.
Yeah, I think that's when I say it doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to us or rational people who are interested in justice or looking at it from that standpoint. But in the South at the time, and with him, you couldn't succeed yourself in office. So, and he was leaving office in a couple of months. There'd already been an election, and he was leaving, but he had other aspirations. He ran for state senate down the road, and he had other plans, and he could run again in 4 years. So it would have been the same thing if he would have testified for the prosecution. His political career would have been over. And there was all that pressure from the citizens' councils. And plus, he was one who was angry over the way the South had been attacked as well, or Mississippi. And that played a role in that too.
Yeah, well, and we do know that he actually helped select the jury members.
I know that. Well, I don't know that. You mean like the panel that they chose them from, or the jury itself, or?
Yeah, I know Jerry Mitchell had mentioned something about that he was involved in selecting the jury, and I don't know if that meant the panel or the jury itself.
I'm that I don't remember coming across anything like that.
Okay.
I know that when they were questioned, well, one thing when the jury panel was questioned and they took that day and a half to select the jury, the prosecution was trying to find people who didn't know. They went out of their way to find people who didn't know Milam and Bryant.
Right.
The defense thought that was the perfect strategy for them because people who knew them didn't like them.
Right.
And they'd had trouble with them. You know, they were considered what was called Peckerwoods, who was just a lower class of white people.
Right.
And so most whites in the certain section of Tallahatchie County, I guess the hill part of the county, didn't like them. And so they're the ones that the prosecution tried to stay away from. And so the defense sat back and thought, perfect strategy for us. So they kind of let them do that. Now, I think the defense may have objected to some others that they thought would, people who did know Milam and Bryant or something like that, to in case that was overlooked somehow by the prosecution. So I think they were happy with the way the prosecution was doing it, and they didn't let them in on that because they knew that they were playing right into their hands. But I'm not aware of Strider having played a role. Because the sheriff, unless he was doing some things behind the scenes,
okay,
but the sheriff in the courtroom wasn't involved in that.
Well, but you do have a panel, a jury that is selected at this point that becomes, you would consider probably more blue collar, if you will, than professionals, because a lot of the professionals would have been able to get off of jury duty to begin with. And so you have a group of people that are feeling, let's just be honest, that are probably racist to begin with, and that feel that, blacks are moving too far and, and wanting their rights and these sort of things. And so, and that they want to reset the status quo, maintain the status quo, reset things from Brown versus Board. And that this is, if there's one way for them to do this in their lives, this is the way to do it, is through this trial. At least they can get a little something out of it.
And not that a jury would have ever convicted Milam and Bryant at that time anyway, but Emmett Till's murder came really at the worst possible time because everybody was so upset over Brown and the backlash with the formation of the citizens councils, and they were very strong in all 65 counties of the state. The governor's race that promised to keep segregation alive forever, that got people worked up. And so even though jury members, already had all that stuff in their head before they ever were chosen. And the ones that were weeded out were, weeded out because they asked them if they gave to the defense money jars, if they were related to them, all that stuff. But the one thing they couldn't help with any white person was that they'd seen all this anti-segregation stuff flare up, and they were.
Well, so you say something interesting that they already had it in their head, and in this day and age, a lot of white people still have that in their head, and all they needed was something to light that fire, to really just be open about it. And I don't know if in the South at that time, people were necessarily not everyone was out there, obviously beating people and so forth, beating African Americans, but they were definitely, had racist tendencies. But suddenly when you had this flare up and it became okay, if you will, because the press, the politicians, everything else is going on, that now suddenly people are a little more open to going around and beating people and pulling them off the streets, like the fears that were very real that Levon, that you talk about.
Right.
That wasn't necessarily every single day someone was walking around beating somebody.
Right.
Now, what were these outside agitators and everything else? Everyone was really on the edge. And we're not too far removed from that, from what we see going on today. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Levon.
Well, no, not well, because it goes on today because they've been given permission to come out of hiding.
Right.
So people are doing a lot of the stuff that they did back in the day, or that they wanted to do, or that they felt they didn't have to do because we knew our place. The black person knew his place, and they only had to deal with the ones who got out of hand, or they had to do enough to make an example of those people. But they've been given, all of those kinds of people have been given permission to come out of their hiding places because people of color are now demanding things from them.
Mm-hmm.
So they've come out of their hole, whatever they were, but they've been told to do that. Just like they've been told by the people back in the day with the citizens councils, they were not denying that any of this went on. You have the Klan would meet and they would have their thing, but they were talking to the members of the citizens council. They were the same people. So that's all that's happening now, is that the people are being told, well, they don't have to be told. The people are being encouraged to fight for their rights, to fight for their way of life,
right,
to fight for states' rights.
Well, we're seeing, Levon, like right now. I mean, when the president of the United States says to suburban housewives,
oh yeah,
there's the fear that they're going to, Biden is going to ruin suburbia for you, which is translation that people of color are going to invade your neighborhoods.
Well, in case they missed it, he was going to put what's his name in charge. There was going to be Booker was going to be in charge of them.
Right.
So to make sure they got that message.
Right.
To have him not
black people are going to take over is the fear.
That's all he's saying.
Which is what was happening in '55, was the fear coming back with Brown versus Board, right? Miscegenation, all this sort of stuff. Black people are going to take over. I mean, the parallels are eerie, so it's
the fear has always been that the black person is going to do what the white person has been doing.
Right.
They don't realize that's what they're doing, but that's always been their fear. And that's always what they bring up. They bring up miscegenation. You need two to do that. Right. It's not rape. Miscegenation is not rape. So, and you can't go to bed. So if it's not rape, you're not going to be in bed with a white woman without her permission. But they get so angry. They get so worked up about it. It just goes away. Mm-hmm. So they decide that the black guy, is going to do all the things that they did. And that what they do is all right. And that's what's going on now.
Right.
We have the president that says you can't vote by mail. Meanwhile, the same guy says, send me a ballot so I can vote by mail.
Right.
Send my family a ballot. I mean, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But that's what people are buying.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Devery, thinking about the system that's in place, is that the reinforcement that takes place. So during the trial, we do know that a cross was burned at the hotel where the jury was sequestered. And then the White Citizens Council, I believe it was White Citizens Council, was the ones that actually visited the jury and kind of, asked them how they were going to vote, or at least, encouraged them in how they should vote.
Yeah.
Jury tampering is what's going on. It's basically,
Yeah. So they knew that they were expected to vote a certain way, and the cross burning certainly was a way to scare that into them. One thing that I learned recently in talking to a grandson of one of the jurors is that even though they were sequestered, they were able to hear things going on across the street, that their windows were open and the courthouse windows were open, like moments where they were, I'd have to refresh myself on the interview that I had with this guy recently. But he told me his grandfather was able to hear things, not so much from the Citizens Council's members. I mean, they may have come over and done as Steve Whitaker learned doing his thesis, but they were able to hear things, so there was that intimidation that came from the Citizens Council, and then what was supposed to be kept from them so that they would be a fair jury was not kept from them so well, because they were hearing things going on from either the attorney's office or the courtroom.
Right.
I think he said he could hear stuff being talked about in the attorney's office, that maybe those windows were open for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that was their way. The attorneys were trying to get them, that was some deal they'd had arranged, or they knew they were supposed to do that or whatever. But that his grandfather actually, heard things the jury wasn't supposed to hear to keep them impartial.
Wow.
So it was all this stuff that was going on there. And so, the system there and the way it was set up and I'm sure typical was that this jury wasn't going to be fair, and that, so it was perfectly set up for the Citizens Councils to come along and intimidate. And maybe they didn't even have to intimidate. Maybe they knew what side to vote on from the beginning, and they just had to get a reminder from Citizens Council members. I don't know, but whatever happened, it was a quick acquittal.
I think that's important. It was a reminder more than an order, because people already believed they wanted to do what was right for their society, the white society. They wanted to do that anyway. They were just looking for a way to do it. And many of them, I wasn't in the room, but I think some of them might have been torn one way or the other. And what they heard was a way of telling them, you do the right thing here.
Right.
Because don't forget that they've been told every day of their life that their way of life is being threatened. Whether they thought it was wrong or not to do what they did to Emmett Till is irrelevant. If they felt that their way of life, that their rights were being trampled. So for those few, 2 or 3, who felt that they needed to do the right thing, if you leave the window open, the council talks, the judges talks, the lawyers talk. Well, when they walk into court the next day, they've been given their marching instructions. Not only that, it gives those in the room, it allows them the ability to say, you know what to do here. Right. So
well, it's interesting, Levant, because you say they might know the right thing to do, but they're going to follow what society expects them to do. And Devery, I think later on we found out that, I didn't find anything out, and you found out, or someone found out, that really what was going on was that the jury really knew that these guys were guilty. There wasn't any question of their guilt. They just needed an out so that they didn't have to convict them. At the end, maybe this wasn't Emmett Till's body. And, the whole thing with Carolyn, of course. Now, what Carolyn had to say, the jury never heard, although they actually did hear it because the defense attorneys had spread it in the paper just the day before the trial began.
Yeah, and during the recess of the opening day of trial.
Right. But then, so the jury, even though they might have, believed that these two were guilty, clearly they were looking for a way to get out of actually having to prosecute them, to convict them of his murder. And the out was this idea that Strider had, well, hey, who knows? Maybe it wasn't Emmett Till's body. We just really don't know, and so forth. So the system was making sure that they didn't have to prosecute him.
Yeah, the thing they told reporters was that, well, the state didn't prove its case. We don't know whose that body was. It was too decomposed and damaged to know who it was, and they felt they were able to have a clear conscience and say that. You can put so many things together. I mean, they admit to kidnapping him, the rings on the finger, how did it get there? They're just, but, and people in murders, people get convicted when there's the evidence is circumstantial. That wouldn't have been a first, but that was what they used to acquit him, to acquit them. But yeah, there was no doubt. I think Steve Whitaker said all but one doubted that the body was Emmett Till and that the men were guilty. But they all could cling to, well, that they didn't prove the case.
Right.
And that's how it ended, unfortunately.